Haunted cottage. Where do spirits go? Firstly, this is more of a question pertaining to the existence of a spirit once their place of haunting is destroyed, but I will include the backstory. My family formerly owned a property on Lake Muskoka in Ontario that was known by several extended family members and old family friends to have been haunted by my father's mother, who died in 1968. Part of the house was over 100 years old, the rest built in the 1950s, and the property had been owned by the family since the early 1900s. It was the favorite place of my grandmother, who had spent her whole life visiting there until she passed away. From the early 1970s onwards, numerous people, including two of my three aunts, my father's sisters, physically saw the ghost of their mother on numerous occasions in what we call the third bedroom, sitting on the bed and also in the kitchen. They said they could feel some sort of connection when the spirit was present. My great aunt, the spirit's sister, claims to have sat next to the spirit on one of the couches in the main living room during one of the big parties in the summer, and to have strongly felt her presence while visiting the house. My grandfather's mistress also claimed to have experienced the spirit while sitting in an antique rocking chair and being quite violently shoved out of it while she was visiting at some point. These people are mostly normal individuals who are not the type to fabricate stories such as these, and therefore I cannot help but believe them to be true to some extent. Personally, I've never experienced or saw anything involving this spirit, nor did either of my parents, my brother, or any of our guests during our times there, as far as I'm aware. A few years after my grandfather's passing, around 2001, my father and sisters decided to sell the property. The new owner tore the old house down and built a new house on roughly the same spot. The property has since been bought and sold twice. My question is, what would have happened to the spirit of my grandmother? Would it be likely that she is still there, attached to the property? Or would she have simply disappeared once the original house was torn down? I've not really had much of a chance to discuss this with anyone. My parents don't really believe in these things, but I'm very fascinated by it. I still have quite an attachment to the old property, and I still visit the area about once a year, and every time I see it, I get very drawn in and curious. I really miss the place, but I don't miss trying to go to sleep at night in the third bedroom, especially after hearing about all these experiences. A Smugglers Cottage. States is in a small town located in North Yorkshire, United Kingdom, that is quite popular with tourists. Going back in time over 200 years ago, the town was a very busy fishing port, with lively fish auctions at the harbor and horses and carts rushing back and forth to trade with nearby towns. Amongst all this hustle and bustle, the undercover industry of smuggling was rife. High taxes on imported luxury goods, such as liquor, tobacco, and tea, led many down an unlawful path to obtain them. Networks of underground tunnels were used to transport the prohibited cargo to be enjoyed away from the prying eyes of custom officers. What if the electric atmosphere that was created by these illicit activities left an impression that could still pick up on today? Or maybe it is possible that the ghosts of those involved still haunt their former residences. I would have said neither was possible until my stay in a former Smugglers Cottage over 10 years ago. As a young teenager, the prospect of spending a week in a haunted house would have terrified me. So when my parents rented out a holiday cottage in the States and were warned about its apparent haunting, they chose not to disclose it to me until we returned. This makes what happened all the more frightening, as psychologically, I was not expecting to experience anything supernatural. The cottage was 3 stories high, with my bedroom in the attic space. From the first day we arrived, I hated being alone in there, as there was just something oppressive about the atmosphere. As I unpacked my suitcase, it felt as though there were a pair of eyes boring into the back of my head. After a brilliant day crab fishing in the harbor, I reluctantly climbed the stairs to my room. As I lay there in the darkness, I felt frozen in fear as I heard faint whispers around me and brushes against my skin by invisible hands. I cried out in terror and insisted that my mom stay in the twin bed opposite, which she ended up doing for the duration of the holiday. In the cold light of day, I wonder if it all had been my imagination running wild, and the following night I was undisturbed. However, it became noticeable even to my parents, who were skeptical about the ghostly activity, that the lights in the cottage seemed to have a life of their own. As you exited a room and turned the light off, when you returned, it would be on again. This happened frequently, and whether it was paranormal or not, it sent a chill down your spine. The following evening, we visited a local pub, and upon our return, my heart almost stopped as the kitchen cupboard door opened by itself and then slammed shut. This particular cupboard opened up into the cliff face and was perhaps used by the smugglers centuries ago. Another freaky experience happened while in the shower, as a feeling of dread washed over me, like someone was standing behind the shower curtain, and all of a sudden, I was overcome by the strongest smell of stale tobacco. Finally, the night before we left, I ascended the stairs to retrieve something from my bedroom. As I reached the top of the stairs, I looked back down to notice the light was on again. I crept back across the landing and quickly turned it off, not wanting to be in the attic space another second. As I again reached the top of the stairs, to my horror, I saw the light was on again. Before I could react, I found myself tumbling down the stairs. I was unharmed but completely shaken up, and I demanded that my father search the room, as I was convinced that I had been pushed. As we packed up and left the next day, I was glad I wouldn't have to stay another night. Even though the experience was terrifying, it captivated my interest in the paranormal and my love for North Yorkshire. States has a colorful history with the tales of ghosts, witches, and mermaids, and whether what I experienced was paranormal or merely psychological remains to be seen. The Cottage. When I was in my early 20s, and just married to Larry, my first husband, now ex-husband, we rented a cottage from my grandmother that was on her property. It was of 5 acres in Marin County, California. My great-grandparents bought the property in 1933, moving across Oakland, California to Marin. The cottage was already there, so you get an idea of how old it was. It began for me in 1986. This is a true recollection to the best that my memory can deliver. The first I noticed something off was coming home one day and seeing all of my carved wooden animal figurines turned opposite of how I had set them on the mahogany table by the picture window in the living room. I was shocked because I knew Larry wasn't a person who played pranks. However, I asked him when he arrived home from work, and he denied having anything to do with it. The next thing that occurred was a knocking in the wall between the living room and an extra room that was actually an enclosed porch room. I was seated in my rocker, reading a romance novel, and there was a rapping on the wall. A constant rap, rap, rap. Not a pounding, but rather a knocking as if someone were at the door. At first, I thought it was an animal. The more this happened, in different areas of the house, I doubted it was an animal. Once, I called Larry into the kitchen to hear this knocking, but when he got up from the chair in the living room and walked to the kitchen, it stopped. That was frustrating because it kept happening more and more, and he wouldn't believe me. We had those roll-up shades on all our windows, and many times they would simply fall off onto the floor. I would go and inspect them, looking for a breeze or something that may have knocked them off, but I couldn't find any source for the shades to fall as much as they did. Things began to disappear, and I would search everywhere for and never find, like cassettes and books, etc. I remember once a heavy candle fell off the bookshelf and I yelled, "Stop it!" The more strange things happened, I became aware of a feeling of being watched. In the living room against the wall was a rattan desk. One evening, I was seated there writing, and I just knew someone was in the room behind me. The hair at the nape stood up, and I swung around and said, "I know you're here." Then the terror began for me. We were in bed, sleeping, and I opened my eyes to a black figure standing right there by the side of the bed with a sawed-off shotgun pointed directly in my face. I screamed and screamed so loudly that Larry jumped out of bed and ran for the light. Once the light was flickered on, the figure was gone. The next time this happened was maybe the next week. I was in bed and I would open my eyes, and there by the bed was this black figure, featureless but human in shape, more short and broad, perhaps 5 feet. I remember blinking my eyes and thinking, this isn't a dream. I'm awake and it is here. This thing is right there and I can see it clearly. This time, in its hand and raised over me was a 6-bladed knife. I'd never seen one before. It had one handle and the blades were curved and turned inward, and all were pointed at me, down. The thing raised it with passion as if to plunge it inside me. Again, I screamed over and over so hard that Larry jumped out of bed and turned on the light. I have to tell you that I've never been more frightened. If I had a bad heart at that time, I have no doubt that my health would have suffered. When I told people like my parents and friends, they thought I was suffering from night terrors. I do not believe this is the case after years of searching, and it was not sleep paralysis. I've read intensively on these subjects, and none seem to apply to my case. This entity, or whatever it was, began to appear more frequently. Once it had a sword over my head, and I could see the moonlight reflecting off the blade as if it were to plunge into me. Again, my screaming got Larry up and the light on. Only one time, it appeared on Larry's side of the bed. In its hand was a baseball bat. I was so terrified that I would try and crawl under Larry to get away from this thing. Larry was a terrible snorer, so one night I kicked him out and into the porch room to sleep. That night, the black figure appeared again, and this time I screamed and got out of bed. Running to the window, I pushed it open and knocked out the screen and had one leg out when the lights went on. I stopped and turned to Larry, and he was calling to me. I'm glad he stopped me because the fall was a 2-story one onto brick steps. Only once did I see a white figure in the house. It was in the early morning, and I opened my eyes and looked in towards a small hallway between the bedroom and bathroom, and there was a white figure looking at me. I gasped and sat up in bed. When this thing saw me looking at it, it actually ran into the kitchen. I was horrified. Jumping out of bed, I grabbed my father's hunting rifle, which was in its case under the bed, and ran with it to the bathroom and locked the door. I took out the rifle, loaded it, and stood trembling behind the door, telling this thing that I had a loaded gun and I wasn't messing around. My language was not that tame. I think I stood in a bathroom for maybe 5 minutes, and finally opened the door and walked around the little house to find nothing. No door was open, and nothing was out of place. It came to a point that I was afraid to go to bed. I spent many late nights up in the living room watching movies and dozing on the couch. This story is very long and too many details for here, so I'm going to try and trim it a bit and bring it to its ending. This all ended on January 8th, 1987. It was approximately 7 a.m., and I was sleeping when I was awakened by a strange noise. At first, I thought it was a deer on the roof, One corner of the cottage was right up against the hill, so many times deer would climb up onto the roof and walk around. Anyway, I lay my head back down and was going to try and sleep a bit more, when a disembodied voice said in my right ear, "Get up!" I did just that, and when I opened the bedroom door, I saw the kitchen had smoke in it. The cottage was on fire. I ran to the porch room and stupidly opened the door, and the room was engulfed in flames. I ran back to the kitchen and called 911. The dispatcher told me to set the phone down and get out, which I did. The house was gone, and we lost everything. I had nothing but my PJs. My grandmother rebuilt the cottage that same year, and Larry and I moved to Sonoma County, wine country. I had never experienced anything like this after the fire. I haven't even had a nightmare and certainly no night terrors. I've seen no black figures, nor any white figures. Very strange coincidence happened after the fire. My grandmother received a letter from a former tenant who had rented from my grandparents in the 1950s. Her name was Mrs. Smith, and she said in the letter that her husband, who had forbade her to write the letter to my grandmother, but he had recently passed. Mrs. Smith wanted to know if anyone had anything strange happen in the cottage. I remember well my grandmother and I looking at each other in utter shock. Mrs. Smith went on to tell of entities she had seen in the cottage. One was an old man. My grandmother and I immediately recalled another tenant named Barbara, who had rented a cottage in the early 70s. We all thought she was crazy when she reported to my grandparents that odd things were happening in the cottage. I was a kid at the time, and Barbara told me that someone kept knocking on the front door, and when she would go to look out the window to see who it was, no one was there. Fast forward to 2005, the cottage and my grandmother's house was sold after her death, but my parents were still living on the same 5 acres at the base of the driveway. In other words, there was the first house as you enter the property. The lady who owned the cottage loved the place. She and my mother became pretty good friends. One day, she went to speak to my mom. She asked if anything strange had ever happened at the cottage. My mother remained silent. She knew of my experience but said nothing. Anyways, this lady proceeded to tell my mother that her niece had been staying with her and was awakened at night to see a black figure standing by the bay tree outside the porch room window. It frightened her, and she soon left. Of course, my mother couldn't wait to call me to tell me this. At once, I said, "See, you all thought I was nuts. I was one of the 4 females that these entities appeared to. I have wondered all my life what these things were. The only thing I can tell you is that black figure seemed to me to be male. It also seemed to me to be evil. This wasn't something that was friendly. It seemed to be sadistic and enjoy my panic." One more thing I want to mention. My grandmother used to tell me that there was an old Indian burial ground near the cottage. This is what someone told her. I have no idea if this is true, but there was a lot of Native American tribes in Marin County. Let me state that I am agnostic. I was not raised in any religion, but am open-minded. I just want to know what this black figure could have been. Thank you for reading.